This video is going to focus on a special VBA program type called functions. Functions are very similar to subs or sub-procedures, except that functions can return a value, and hopefully I'm going to demonstrate that. Now let's suppose that right here we have some quiz scores, quiz 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we want to calculate the average. Now, we know that if you put an equal sign there and start typing, you can find a function named average, and it accepts a bunch of numbers. We also know that we could have found the average up here. And if we select these numbers, we know that we can get the average, which is 83.2. So let's look at how we might write a function that does something like that, or something that is not already written, which would obviously be the preference. So I'm going to come here into VBA, and we're going to call this average scores. Notice that I've written this as a sub. Now I'm going to declare 5 variables. So here I've declared 5 variables, one for each of the scores, and then I've declared some other variables that I'm going to use in the program. Total scores will be all of these 5 scores added up. The number of scores will be the number that I need to divide the total by, which would be, in this case, 5, and the average score would be the result. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in. So here I've taken the values from the Excel spreadsheet D3 through H3, and I've put them into my variables. Now I'm just going to do my variable calculation, or my calculation here to get total scores. Okay, so I've added score 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and put that into total scores, and I've taken the number of scores that I have, 5, put it into num scores. Total scores divided by num scores gives me my average score. So when I run this, I'm going to get 83.2, which is the average of all of these added up. Now, rather than just display it back to the user, I'd like to store it here, and that's going to be an I3, so I'm going to change this just a little bit. And we can now, as we run this, take the value and put it here, and now it can be stored. Now the problem with this is that I always have to go to D, E, F, G, and H3, and always have to put my result into I3. What if I want to take any 5 values and I want to put it in any place? Well, we're going to want to change this so that we can do that. We're going to make this more flexible so that it can take any 5 values, and what we're going to do is make this so that it takes up to 5 values and puts the answer wherever we use this here. So we're going to make some changes here. We're going to change this from a sub to a function. And the difference between a sub and a function is that a sub cannot give whoever calls it a value back where a function can. And that'll become apparent here as we go on. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to take these variables, and rather than declare them here, I'm going to put them up between the parentheses. So you'll notice I've put score 1, score 2, score 3, score 4, and score 5 as double up here. When I put values here, I don't need to dim them or declare those variables there. Now the only problem is that because this is a function that receives, these are called arguments or variables, this program can now not run by itself. And it needs to have these values given to the program when the program is run. It cannot receive them here like this. So I'm going to take that piece out, and in order to run this I would do something like this. I would write another sub. I'm going to just say test average scores, and I'm going to call this by typing its name, average scores, and then I'm going to hit a space, and you're going to notice that it's going to tell me I need score 1, and it needs to be a double, score 2, and it needs to be a double, score 3, 4, and 5, and they need to be doubles. So I can give it any number. I can give it 12, 34, 40, 54, 11, and 22. Now, before we do this, I'm going to come up here and I'm going to add a watch for each one of these variables. Got an extra one there. So I have 5 variables here, and what you're going to see, I'm going to run test average scores, and I'm going to call the average scores function. And as soon as I run this, you see that these values already have the values that I sent from here in them. Now notice they're in order of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so they're in alphabetical order here. But these are the values that I sent them. It takes the first one and puts it in 1, so that should be 12, and it is. It takes the second one, 34, puts it in the second one, which is score 2, and there it is, 34, and the third one into score 3, and the fourth one into score 4, as you can see, and the fifth one into score 5, as you can see. So it's functioning properly. Now I can use those variables. As you can see, I'm going to add 22, 11, 12, 54, 34, put it into, let's add a watch here. Put it into total scores for 133. Average score, when we take total scores and divide it by 5, our average score is going to be 26.6. It put it in I3. Let's check. Yep, there's 26.6. And then I come back to test average scores, and I'm done running. Now I could have also done this with this left as a sub, and we'll run this again just so you can see. You get the same values when you run this as a sub. So a sub and a function can both have what we call arguments here. In other words, they can accept values in order to calculate them when they run. Now the problem is, if I don't give it enough values, let's suppose that I only give 4 scores here, or 3. Now I'm going to get an error that says the argument is not optional. You have, when you declare here arguments in a program, you cannot run the program unless all the arguments required are provided. Now as soon as I do that, it sees that I have 5 and I require 5, so I can go ahead and finish running properly. However, once I get back to test average scores, I don't know what the average score was. So we're going to change this now. In order to have it do what we call pass a value back, we have to have this back to a function. Notice that'll change that to end function. And what we do here is we come to after the parenthesis and we put as and then the data type that we want it to pass back. In this case, it's going to be as double. I'm going to take this off right here. I'm going to get rid of this variable named average score, and I'm going to change this right here to av scores. Now notice that this is the same name as the name of the function. When you create a function, by default in the background you create a variable that has the same name. And by assigning a value to that variable within the function, we can then send a value back to whoever called this function. So I'm going to put parentheses around these numbers right here, and now I can come in and say message box average scores, and I'm going to send it to these scores, and now let's see what happens. So I've got all of my scores. I'm going to add them in, divide them by 5. Oops, I spelt this wrong. Good thing we make a change before we run it. So there we go. Should have the same name now. And when we come back, our message box gives us 26.6, which is what we calculated before. So that is the correct average. So that is the way we return a value or have a function calculate a value and give us it back. This would be very similar to us doing something like this. We'll make that so that doesn't run. Message box, and we would say present value, at 5% divided by 12 for 180 periods. If I'm making a $900 payment and there is no future value. Now what this would do for me is tell me that the present value of making a $900 payment every month for 15 years at 5% annually is going to give me $113,809 when I'm done. And you guys have all done this before. This is present value as a function, just like our average score functions here, or just like we've done here. It requires specific variables, and we provide those variables here also. So now we're going to look at how we might use this average scores in Excel, just like we would use our present value that we had here just a minute ago in Excel. So the first thing that I would do, I can come up here and I can come to Insert Function, and I can go to Categories, and I can go to User Defined, and there's my average score function. I can go ahead and hit OK, and it will say Score 1, and I just click on it. Score 2, and I click on it. And Score 3, and I click on it. Score 4, I click on it. And Score 5, and I click on it. And notice it gives me the average of all of those scores, and it's going to store that right here where I put my average score function. I can also just come up here and hit Functions and find my average score, and I can go in and I can put those in. Or another thing I can do, if I know the name of my function, I can just start typing. One of the problems, though, is it doesn't tell us the list of variables that we need to provide. If I want to know that, I just click up here, and it'll give me the wizard just like it did before, and I can go ahead and put those in and make this work. And if I change one of these scores, it will recalculate, and you can see the average changing. Now, yes, you could have used the average function like I mentioned at the beginning, but this is just a tutorial on how you would build functions. Now, if I were to take if I were to have 100 in all of these, of course my average is 100, but if I take one of these out, notice my average is 80. The reason my average is 80 is because I hard-coded the number of scores here to be 5. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, we'll get rid of that here. I'm going to change this so that, first of all, I can accept optional arguments. What an optional argument does is if one is missing, it will tell me that I don't have enough arguments. Now in the case that we had here, I had 5 cells, and so it worked just fine because it took the value 0 from there. But if I were to get rid of one of these arguments, then I would get this value because I haven't given it enough arguments. And that works just fine. So, what if I really only had 4 scores and I didn't want to have to include a 5th? How would I handle that? Well, what I would do, I would come up here and add the word optional before each one of my variables, except for number 1, because I can't do an average unless I have at least 1. So I'm going to leave that there. Okay, now what that will do is if I have 1 missing, it will calculate just based on the 4. Now I've got a little bit of a problem here because my num scores is still 5. So I'm going to put some logic in just to count how many of these that I have. In order to count, what I'm going to do is set these each to a default value, and I'm going to put equal to -1 on the end of each one of these. And what that will do, that says if a value isn't provided, go ahead and use -1 as the default value. So we can look at the effect on our calculation here. Since I only have 4, and let's delete and let's hit calculate now. Notice when I recalculated this, my average dropped because this was 100, 100, 100, 100, and 1 is missing here. As you can see, I only have 4 arguments, so it replaced the 5th one with -1, which would drop the average. Well, I want to put some logic in that says basically just count it that way. So what I'm going to do is come right here and I'm going to say if score 2 is equal to -1, then basically what that means is I know that no value was given for score 2. And if that's the case, I'm not going to add anything to num scores. In fact, I'm going to take that off of there. But what I'm going to do is change this. I'm going to say if score 2 is greater than -1. So what that's going to do for me, that's going to say, okay, if it's 0 or greater, in other words, they have given me a value, but the value is 0. And you would want to include that in case someone got a 0 on a quiz or someone didn't show up. So then you would just say num scores is equal to num scores plus 1. Now we're going to initially assume that score 1 has a value in it, so we'll say num scores is equal to 1. So num scores starts off as 1, and I'm going to copy this for each one of my variables. Okay, so here are the changes that I've made. First here I've said num scores is equal to 1 because you have to at least provide 1 score, and total scores is equal to score 1 because that is required. All of the other scores are optional. So I don't know if the other scores have been added. So what I do is I say score 2, if it's greater than -1, and I defaulted it to -1, so if it's greater than -1, I know they have a score there. I add 1 to the number of scores. So I take the 1 that's already there and I add 1 to it, so now it's going to be 2. Take the total score value, add the second score value to it, and place it back in the total. And I check for each one of these, and I only increment the number of scores and the total that they've given me if there's not a -1 there. In other words, if they have provided a value. Then I'm going to take the total and divide it by the number, and I'm going to get my averages. So let's just try this and see what happens. So I'm going to come here and we'll delete. Notice that's 50 because I still have 4 places. So if I were to take that off, now the average is 100. If I add a 50 here and a 50 here and a 50 here, it doesn't change the average because I haven't included those. But if I say F3 and and G3 and H3, then it's going to go ahead and take the average of 250, which is, in this case, 70. Or excuse me, 350. And if I change any of these numbers, the calculation changes as I go along. So what's happened here, just to kind of review, I had to rename this from sub to function because I'm going to give it a value back. So in order to indicate what type of value I'm giving it back, I'm going to put as double. Then all of the values that have to be provided in order for this to run have to be provided within the parentheses. Notice I'm giving a name and I'm giving a data type. If it's optional, I'm putting the word optional there. And because I want to be able to check if it's no score given versus just a 0 given, then I'm going to go ahead and put -1 there. So if they only click on 2 places or 3 places for scores, then I can filter out the extras. Then I declared my total scores and number of scores, set my number of scores to 1, my total scores just to the first one because that's required. And then I go through each time and I check if the variable is greater than 1, that I know a value has been entered, or at least it's been used. And I increment 1 to the number of scores, and I take the total score, whatever's in there, add score 2 to it, and add it back, and I do that for 3, 4, and 5. Then I take the total scores, divide it by the average, or by the number of scores, and put it in a variable that's called average, or AVG scores, which is the same name of the function. It has to be the same name as the function. And then it will put the result of that function right there.